Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and a couple of weeks ago I did a VR to Mags talking about my sharpshooters and my deep divers. And I got a question from one of my viewers asking about how do I distinguish energy or read cards differently across different decks when, the same card, the Three of Swords, is the Three of Swords, right? And so I thought that was a really interesting question. There was more to it than that, but that was kind of the takeaway that sometimes it can be a bit confusing for people when we talk about like the different energies of the deck or the different voices of a deck, or how we can take this same card and read it differently across different decks. So I'm gonna attempt to address that from my own personal point of view. So I'm going to talk about how I personally look at the energies and the voices, and in as such as I relate it to kind of a personality. I do personify my deck. So basically that means that for me, each of these little decks is like a little friend, although they are just like ink and paper. I mean, I know that, which is why I have no problem modifying my decks, because this is just cardstock ink and paper. It's replaceable. Now, I do have some decks that are out of print, and you could get into that whole issue of what's replaceable and what's not. But all of the decks that I have here today are still available. I do have 2 indie decks here, but the rest of these are mass market. They're readily available. They are inexpensive. And at the end of the day, a tarot deck is paper and ink. But I do feel like everything in the world is energy and is, made of energy and resonates with energy. And so I feel like that energy that I pick up on when I look at artwork in a deck is what I'm talking about when I personify a deck. So this is a really big subject, and I'm gonna try to kind of condense it down into something that is hopefully makes some sense and isn't too into the weeds here. But for example, this is my Green Witch Tarot, and because of the style of artwork, this deck feels very friendly and approachable. We don't have a ton of really confronting cards like we do in some other decks, and I'll show you a couple of those here in a little bit. But overall, like the imagery is pretty friendly. There's nothing too terribly confronting in this deck. And so I tend to think of this deck as like a friendly deck, right? That's kind of its base energy. Reading the guidebook taps me into the kind of supportive energy of this deck, because a lot of the messages in the guidebook really cultivate an idea of finding support within and care and compassion within these cards. So therefore I kind of layer that on there, because now I'm looking at the artwork, the messages that come through the guidebook. I've had this deck for a really long time, and I've used it for a really long time. So I personify it as an old friend, because it's a deck that I've used a lot, I'm very familiar with, and I really enjoy working with. Now, when it comes to the type of readings that I do with this deck, I do tend to use it for just everyday sort of readings, but I also tend to go to this deck when I am looking for support or like advice that I might get from a friend, right? So those are the type of readings that I tend to go to this deck to. And I think for me, at least, when I talk about a deck's energy and how it speaks to me and things like that, all of those little things kind of come into play. So I'm looking at the artwork, the actual literal artwork on the card, and what emotion that evokes in me. The artwork in this deck evokes the idea of friendliness and support. And as I've mentioned many times, this deck to me feels like a deck of old friends. It feels like coming home. I can pick up this deck and I can read with it anytime for anything. And part of that comes from having used it for so long that I have a really good understanding of how to work with this deck. And so that gets translated into, this is a friendly deck. It's an approachable deck. It's also a Rider-Waite-Smith based deck, so it's very familiar in its depiction. So I don't struggle with the messages, and therefore it's kind of an easy reader. And so I kind of see it as like, a friend you would sit down and have coffee with, and you're just going to have a chat. It's not going to be something super deep and in-depth and challenging and struggling. It's going to come pretty quick and easy. So when I talk about a deck's energy or how it reads for me or how it speaks to me, those are kind of all the things that I'm looking at, I'm layering in there. I'm looking at the artwork and what it sparks in my intuition for me. I'm looking at how it makes me feel. Does it make me feel uncomfortable? Does it make me feel supportive? And it really comes down to, what do these images make me feel, right? Do I find these images to be soothing and comforting and supporting, which I do in this deck? Or do I find them to be a little bit jarring and off-putting, like I do in, say, something maybe the Barbara Walker Tarot? I'm looking at the guidebook and what do the messages have to say in there? What was the creator's intention in this deck? What have they created it with in mind? If that's available for me to discover, I always like to check that out. And then, what type of readings do I tend to use this deck for? I don't often set out with a deck and go, this is going to be a deck that I'm going to use for this, that, or the other before I've ever worked with it. Because I really don't know what I'm going to end up using a deck for until I discover what its voice is for me. So how do I relate to the artwork? How do the images make me feel? What thoughts do they bring to mind? What do I feel? What do I see? What do I experience when I hold this deck? And as I work with the deck over time, what type of readings do I tend to go to it for? So something that I might go to the Green Witch Tarot for is something like, if I wanted, advice from a friend, right? That's the kind of energy or the experience that I've had with this deck over the years. It does feel like this is the type of message that I would get if I went to a friend and said, hey, here's what's going on. And so I do use this deck a lot for that kind of readings. Whereas a deck, say the Forest of Enchantment, or Tarot of an Enchanted Forest, what is the name of this deck? I do this every time. Forest of Enchantment, I think that's the name of it. Whereas with this deck, this is not a deck that I go to for friendly advice. I actually find this deck to be quite confronting a lot of the time. I actually find it to be quite challenging. It definitely tends to pull things out of my subconscious, out of my, maybe you could call that my shadow self. Although it's very into the kind of naturey woods green, right? Kind of similar to the Green Witch Tarot. For me, this deck has a totally different voice, a totally different energy, because the images evoke different feelings in me. And the guidebook for this particular deck really does enhance that. Because when I go to the guidebook, when I pull these cards, it kind of does resonate with that sort of in the shadowy kind of energy, right? This is what's going on in the deep, dark parts of the woods. And to me, this deck feels like a deck that kind of taps into the subconscious mind, like what's going on beneath the surface. And again, that comes from what the artwork brings out of me, the feelings it brings out of me, the emotions it brings out in me, the things that come to mind when I look at this card. So I'm always layering in my tarot knowledge, of course. That's like my baseline. So the 8 of Challenges would be the 8 of Swords. And I can think about the 8 of Swords in a traditional sense and look at how this card depicts that energy differently. So she's not blindfolded as we traditionally see in the 8 of Swords. She's actually covering her own eyes. So she's choosing not to see the situation, whereas in our traditional 8 of Swords, we have the figure that's blindfolded, as in somebody else has probably put that blindfold on. Here you can see the blindfold, it's around her neck, it's just hanging out there, but she's still covering her own eyes, she's choosing not to see the situation. Now that's different than the 8 of Swords in this deck, which thankfully is not too far off from the top. So here's the 8 of Athmes or 8 of Swords in the Green Witch Tarot. And again, you can see that blindfolded figure. And in this one, if we think of the traditional Rider-Waite-Smith 8 of Swords, the 8 of Swords, the 8 actual swords are usually standing up very tall, as in they're almost like creating a cage around the figure. And in this card, the swords are kind of buried in the ground, and there's actually an open space right here. So even though she's walking, she's blindfolded, she's bound, her feet are not bound, so she can still move forward. And she can just step either right over or right through this path that these 8 swords are creating. So that gives a whole different energy, a whole different message when you're looking at the artwork than our traditional 8 of swords, as does this 8 of challenges, because this figure is kind of like buried in the thicket. There's thorns all around. Everything is like tied in around her. She's not actually bound to anything. It's more of this impression of being bound, and she's covering her eyes herself, whereas this person can't actually remove her blindfold because, you know, her hands are tied. This person can drop their hands and look and see what's going on. They're choosing not to. That's, I think, a really great example of how 2 different decks can have the same card and read totally different, because you're looking at the artwork and you're looking at the way that the artwork makes you feel. So if I'm looking at these 2 cards, this artwork makes me feel like, you know, all's not lost, right? I may not know where I'm going, but I just have to trust the journey. That's what this card tells me. Whereas this card tells me there's something that I don't want to see, and I need to drop my hands and take a look and really look at the situation with clarity. Both still have a very 8 of Swords energy, right? These are both Rider-Waite-Smith based decks, so the interpretation is based on the traditional Waite-Smith 8 of Swords, yet they both read completely differently. It's also really important to mention context, and I really want to do a whole video on context at some point, because that is such a huge, huge piece of the puzzle when you're reading tarot. You have to take into consideration the context of the situation that you're reading about, the question that you're asking, the other cards that are on the table. If you're using a spread, what position the card is actually laid down in, and how you're going to interpret this card through the lens of that position. Again, I want to do a whole video on it because that's way outside the scope of this video for today, but context is hugely important. If I pulled this card and in the position or in the context of what do I need to do to move forward, I need to let go. I need to see. I need to drop my hands and see what's going on. But if I pull it in a position of, you know, what's my current challenge? What's holding me back? This inability to accept things the way they are is what's holding me back. You know, just for a very rough example, again, I'm not doing a real reading, so it's hard to say, but that is how I kind of experience or look at the same card through different lenses based on the deck that I'm working with. So that's a little bit of a, you know, card by card type of comparison. If you take 2 cards from the same deck, and unless you're looking at basically 2 Rider-Waite-Smith decks, right? Maybe you're looking at the Radiant Wise and the Centennial Rider-Waite-Smith. Those have pretty much the same imagery, but you can still find differences in those because, you know, there's color, there's mood, there's things that color evokes, that different line work will evoke. And so every deck is unique, in my opinion. Every deck has its own voice. I do choose to personify mine because I think as human beings, it's just kind of natural for us to place human expression on inanimate things because that's our realm of understanding, right? I understand what it is to be a human. I do not understand what it is to be a deck of cards because I'm not a deck of cards. That's a really silly example, but I just choose to personify them because they read for me like having a conversation with a friend. That's how I approach my decks, or in a lot of cases, having a conversation with myself, or having a conversation with deity, or spirit, or angel, or goddess. So yeah, again, I could probably do a whole separate video on personifying my decks too, but I think it's really interesting to look at, you know, different decks and how they can depict totally different energies. So we've got here the Green Witch Tarot and the Forest of Enchantment, both kind of in the nature space, right? It's too bad these are not the same cards, but I didn't put that much forethought into this video. But you can see that they both have a lot of green space. They both have a lot of animals in it. They're both Rider-Waite-Smith based. And the art styles are not quite the same, but they are both fairly traditionally illustrated decks in terms of the type of artwork that we have. You know, we have, I don't know if these are paintings or they look like paintings to me, but they're, you know, they're traditional. It's not a digital compilation as it is, say, in the Zombie Tarot. So they do have a lot of similarities, but they read completely different. This deck reads more like the supportive friend who's going to help you, you know, give you some good advice, have a cup of coffee with you, and chat with you about your day. The Forest of Enchantment feels like the deck that's going to drag you into the shadows with it. It's going to bring up things that are going to confront you. It's going to challenge your notions, your ideas, challenge the experience, and it's going to encourage you to dive deep into the shadowy spaces of the forest with it. And so that's two totally different energies, right? That's two totally different expressions of the system of tarot through the lens of the Waite-Smith structure. Now we could get into whole other decks and systems, but we won't go there. We're going to stick with Rider-Waite-Smith based decks for this video. So that's kind of in a nutshell, as best as I can explain it, how I can take the same card across multiple decks and read them in completely different ways. So let's take a look at a couple more. So here we have two, happen to be indie decks, but two decks that in my particular practice both serve as healing decks, right? Because again, as I mentioned with the Green Witch, that is the thoughts that come to mind when I work with these decks. That is the emotions that it brings to the surface when I work with these decks, which therefore means when I do readings with these decks, that's kind of usually the message I'm looking for, is usually something to do with some sort of healing work. Also in part influenced by the little guidebooks that come with these decks. Both of these decks are very much geared in their interpretations and in their language in the guidebooks toward that kind of healing energy. But it also is the type of readings that I tend to do with these decks. So because of the way it makes me feel, the thoughts that it brings to mind, the words that I find in the guidebook, the pictures that I see in the artwork, because of all of that, I tend to use this deck or these decks for healing style readings. So this is the Future Ancestor Tarot, and this deck actually was created out of a healing process, and the guidebook definitely reflects that. And I love the use of the kind of black and white, which is the pops of very natural colors in here. And it's a kind of collage mixed media style deck because there's I forget the name of the art style, but it's a particular art style and then layered with botanicals. So it's a kind of a mixed media thing. Again, kind of bringing that, in my opinion, bringing the kind of healing energy of the earth into my work with this deck. The Ember and Aura Tarot here is also a healing deck for me, but it has a totally different energy where this deck feels very almost rooted into the earth. This feels up in the heavens. This to me feels like a deck of spiritual healing. So this is more earthly plane healing. This is more spiritual healing. And again, a lot of that comes back to the artwork and the messages in the guidebook. What comes to mind when I look at the deck and what feelings it brings to the surface. There are some slightly Christian flair imagery in here, which I do not mind. I've done a lot of work to come to my understanding of my spiritual path. But for me, this deck definitely speaks to healing with divine feminine energy. It is primarily a feminine deck. There's a lot of female presenting people in this deck. So this deck for me, because of the imagery, what comes to mind when I look at it and what I gain from the guidebook when I use it, definitely feels like it's more of a spiritual healing deck. So again, the work that I tend to do with it tends to reflect that. So it has that energy of being a spiritual healer, where this has the energy or kind of the voice of being a kind of earthly healer, because that's the type of work that I do with it. That's what brings to mind when I look at it. That's what it makes me feel. That's what it makes me think of. And so all of that gets kind of combined into, that's the energy, that's the voice of the deck for me. So let's do 2 more decks real quick, because for me, these 2 decks have a very masculine energy. And actually, they kind of have opposite personalities. Okay, so again, I'm personifying my decks. I'm sorry if that's not something that you jive with, that's cool, but that's just how I express my connection to my deck, is through personification. So these decks have a very masculine energy overall for me, as in they're very logical. They're very straightforward and to the point, not in a brutal way, which we'll look at a brutal deck here in a minute, but just in a very kind of no nonsense kind of way. The Zombie Tarot, which I'm showing here, is actually quite a humorous deck. There's a lot of really cheeky things in this deck, which I do quite appreciate, but it's also a very clear reader. So, which means that in that sense, when I throw down one of these cards, I know exactly what it's trying to tell me. There's not a lot of guessing. It's very to the point. It's very logical most of the time. Like, as in it makes sense, right? I don't struggle with it. It makes sense. You know, we have a moon, we have a person in a bed here, we have a bird bringing the key, you know, obviously she's dreaming, and underneath here, the, you know, zombie apocalypse is going on, but we have like, you know, a man in a tux and a bride and maybe a doctor here. Maybe these are all things that she's dreaming about, but as she's, you know, gone off into the dream world, the zombie apocalypse is happening around her. It's very, again, very straightforward, very to the point. This one does have a bit of a humorous energy to it, as in, like, seriously, the artwork's funny. Like, look at this Queen of Cups. I mean, she's on the beach, she's a zombie, and she's eating some brain. Like, she's doing what she needs to do to nourish her, and that's just cool, because that's what zombies do. It's also one that makes me giggle, which is always great. So kind of on the flip side of that, we have the Modern Spellcasters Tarot, which also has a very masculine energy to me, in terms of it's very direct, very to the point. Again, these are both Rider-Waite-Smith based decks. This one does have a bit of a swap in the elements between the swords and the wands, but I actually don't pay any attention to it. I just read it the way that I normally read it. But again, very clear reader, very logical, very to the point. I never struggle with what the card is trying to tell me. It's very direct. And that's one of the things I think that really kind of makes these 2 decks stand apart from, say, the Green Witch Tarot, which is another one that I don't struggle to work with at all. Like, it's very direct and to the point, but it's very soft and nurturing in the way that the images help me to perceive the message, right? Whereas this, even if you're looking at the art styles, where that's a little bit more faded, it's a little bit more muted, this is very sharp. It's very, very high contrast, bright in a lot of ways, but it's just like sharp is the word that keeps coming to mind. It's very clear, it's very sharp. It feels very much in the realm of, this is just what you need to know, and there's not really a whole lot of question there, right? It's not a deck that I'm going to dive deep into and that I'm going to explore the nuances of all of the imagery. I certainly could. I could do that with any deck, but it's not one that asks that of me. I'm not required to do that in order to work with this deck. It's just a very clear, solid reader in that I know what's going on, I know what it's trying to tell me, and I don't struggle with it. That's another thing that these 2 decks really are. They're really good for practical readings, and again, because of the way that I perceive the artwork, and because of the way that I experience what I'm seeing on the cards and the emotions that it brings out in me, that tends to be the way that I interact with it, is in a practical manner. And so for me now, it's a practical deck, right? It's a practical reader. And that's how I would characterize or describe the energy of these two decks. This one's funny. It's got a sense of humor, but it's practical. This one takes itself quite seriously, actually. It's not funny. It doesn't want you to mess around with it. It doesn't want you to joke with it. Again, this is me personifying my decks, but this is my experience of working with it. When I work with this deck, I'm not in a funny mood, right? It's all a reflection of me and where I am in my reading space at the time when I sit down to read my cards. So when I sit down to read with this deck, I'm not in a funny space. I'm not in a lighthearted kind of mood. I'm in a practical, no nonsense. I just need the message that I need, and I don't want to mess around with it. I just need it quick, easy, clear. That's what I need from this deck, and that is how I work with it. So that's how I personify its energy. Somebody who works with this deck in a different way would categorize it as a totally different energy, which is always really interesting. And I think that's what can kind of make it confusing for people, because the way that I perceive a particular deck can be totally different than the way somebody else perceives a particular deck. When I come to this deck, I come to this deck because I want a fun reading. I want a real reading, right? It's not like it's just all play. I want a real reading. So I want real messages and I want real answers, but I want to have fun with it. And that's what this deck does beautifully. So real quick, let's just talk about a couple other decks here, just to try and kind of hopefully help make some sense of this for people who are new to tarot and wondering what the heck we're all talking about when we're looking at a 9 of Swords across 5 different decks and giving you 5 different answers, right? This one is the Morgan Greer. And I've talked about this one quite frequently as well. For me, this deck has a paternal energy. And the reason it has a paternal energy is because it's very 70s. The men all have mustaches, and that is when I was born. I was born in 1978, and this is what all of my relatives, including my father, looked like through most of the 70s and into the early 80s. Like this could have been my dad. And so when I pick up this deck, when I look at these images, it takes me back to that place and time. It also kind of looks a little bit like the storybooks that I used to read as a kid, as in like the art style looks a little bit like that. But when I look at this deck, that's immediately what comes to mind. Those are the feelings it evokes within me. It feels like I'm looking back at my childhood. And so for me, this deck has paternal energy. All the male figures in this deck look like my male family members from when I was growing up. And actually the females look quite a bit like my female family members from when I was growing up too. And so because I have that personal relationship and connection to the art style and the imagery in this deck, that is how I perceive it. And again, it's another Rider-Waite-Smith, so same exact base meanings across all of these decks, right? But the energy of this one, because of my association to the paternal energy that comes through this deck for me, that's how it reads for me. That's the way I perceive the messages that I'm getting, is through that filter of my own experiences, of my own past. This deck feels like a deck that like my dad might give to me, or like it feels like it has advice. When I pull cards, it feels like something that my dad might say to me. Now on the flip side of that, we have like something like the White Sage Tarot. This is a deck that very similar to the Ember and Aura and the Future Ancestor I could use for healing work. But this deck for me is my self-care deck. And that is primarily because the way that this artwork is depicted feels very nourishing. It feels like if you took the idea of self-care and put it into a deck of cards, that's what this deck is for me. That is what it makes me feel when I look at the images. I know I'm gonna sound like a broken record. That's lens through which I'm viewing the cards, and those are the type of readings that I tend to use when I go to this deck. So we'll just do one more, and then we'll kind of wrap this up. But Barbara Walker Tarot. I've talked about this one many times. This deck is brutal. And again, here we're looking at the imagery, let me bring it in, is very confronting. And so when we talk about this deck, or when I talk about this deck being brutal, that's what I mean. I mean that these images confront me. These images challenge me. They make me think about things in a different way. They don't let me just kind of rest on my base knowledge. They have keywords, they have a little bit different associations. I'm not entirely sure that you would call this a Rider-Waite-Smith deck. It does feel like it has some Thoth influence as well, but this is a great example of a deck that has what I would consider a brutal energy. It's a truth teller. It doesn't let me shy away from the hard reality of the situation. But again, that's because that's how I perceive the artwork. When I see this image, this person looks very much in her power. She looks like she is channeling it, but she's not going to take any crap from anybody. And I get that sense out of a lot of these cards. Like, it's kind of telling you, own your crap, do your work. But again, because that's how I perceive it. That's what comes to mind when I work with it. And, you know, art interpretation in general, because that's what these are. These are 78 works of art. Art interpretation is very subjective, and so it's really hard to say that this deck will read this way for you or feel this way for you, because it's all based on what we perceive, what our past experiences have taught us, what's coming from what we've learned, what we've experienced, and how we've learned to work with the tarot and how we've experienced our journey with the tarot so far. So I don't know if that was helpful at all or if I made any sense, but I thought this was a really great subject. It's a very complex subject. And how do you take something that is so subjective, talking about art, talking about tarot, it's all very subjective. How can you take that and kind of distill that into a this is why we do what we do type of a thing? I'm not sure that I really even did it justice. Again, I think more videos, more discussions, more explorations into how each of us perceive the tarot and the cards and the individual decks. I think that's one of the really wonderful things about TarotTube and why I love watching videos about decks, you know, walkthroughs, unboxings, whatever it is, full reviews, deck collections. I love watching that because I like experiencing decks through somebody else's lens. So when I look at this card, I may see one thing, you may look at this card and see something totally different, and I want to know what you see too. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why I personally like to look at different decks. I like to hear about other people's experiences with decks because it allows me to look at them through their lens. And sometimes I learn things. This is just my lens. This is just my experience with these decks. Somebody else will have had a totally different experience. I know several people who do not like this deck and they cannot get along with it. They don't see the same things in it that I do. They don't have the same experiences with this deck that I do. And that's totally cool because there are decks that I'm like, I don't know what you see in that deck, but I don't get it, right? Because we all experience the tarot through our own personal lens, and so that it's unique for everybody, and I think that is so amazing. I think it's part of what makes tarot really amazing. So anyway, I hope that this has answered maybe some of those questions about how we could read a deck or a card across multiple decks in different ways, about why I personally personify my decks and what I mean when I talk about the energy or the way a deck reads. I hope I've explained that well. I've certainly tried, but I would love to know what your thoughts are on this. You know, do you experience decks differently? How do you categorize your experiences, right? Do you personify them? Do you talk about the energy, or do you just kind of go, this is how a deck reads? I would love to hear about it, so please feel free to share with me in the comments below. As always, my friends, thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you again in another video.